the RAF pilot who flew into tomorrow. In 1935, Wing Commander Victor Goddard was flying his Hawker Hart biplane from Edinburgh back to his base when he encountered a violent storm over Drem, Scotland. The yellow-brown clouds battered his aircraft, forcing him into a terrifying descent. Just when he thought he'd crash into the mountains, sunlight burst through. Below him sat Drem Airfield, which he'd inspected days earlier and found abandoned, overgrown with weeds and grazing cattle. But now it looked brand new. Mechanics in blue overalls worked on 4 yellow aircraft on the tarmac, one a monoplane he'd never seen before. The RAF used brown overalls in 1935, not blue. Their training planes were silver, never yellow. Within moments, the storm swallowed him again. 4 years later, in 1939, everything Goddard witnessed came true. The RAF began painting training planes yellow. They introduced the Miles Magister monoplane. They switched mechanics' uniforms to blue, and Drem Airfield reopened exactly as he'd seen it. Goddard's impeccable military record and specific details make this one of the most compelling time-slip cases ever recorded. He didn't just see the future, he flew through it. 2 academics meet. Marie Antoinette. August 10th, 1901. Charlotte Anne Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain, respected Oxford academics, visited the Palace of Versailles. While searching for the Petit Trianon, they felt an overwhelming oppression descend upon them. The gardens seemed flat, dreamlike. They encountered people in 18th century clothing, including gardeners in unusual uniforms, and a man with a pockmarked face who stared at them with malevolent eyes. Moberly saw a woman sketching on the lawn, wearing period dress and a distinctive white hat. Jourdain didn't see her. When they later researched the date, they discovered August 10th marked the anniversary of the storming of the Tuileries Palace in 1792, when Marie Antoinette's world collapsed. They spent 9 years meticulously verifying details. The pockmarked man matched descriptions of Comte de Vaudreuil. The woman's green silk dress matched seamstress records. The bridge they crossed had been sealed for a century. Buildings they saw had been demolished before 1901. Published as An Adventure in 1911, their account became a literary sensation. 2 distinguished academics staked their reputations on claiming they had walked through Marie Antoinette's final memories of freedom. Neither ever recanted. The Liverpool street where time breaks down. Bold Street in Liverpool, England has earned a reputation as a time-slip hotspot. The most documented case occurred in July 1996, when off-duty police officer Frank and his wife Carol went shopping. While Frank was delayed chatting with a friend, Carol walked ahead to Dylan's bookshop. Minutes later, Frank followed. As he turned onto Bold Street, an eerie silence fell. A 1950s-style van with Kaplan's emblazoned on its side honked and swerved past him. The bookshop now displayed a sign reading, "Crips," with women's clothing in the windows. Everyone around him wore 1950s fashion, women in headscarves and gloves, men in hats and overcoats. A young woman in modern clothing emerged from a shop, as confused as Frank. When they entered together, they found themselves back in Dylan's. "That was strange," she said. "I thought it was a new clothes shop." Frank's police training made him a credible witness. Researchers confirmed Crips had occupied that location decades earlier, and Kaplan's was a real Liverpool company from that era. His wife, inside the bookshop the entire time, experienced nothing unusual. Since Frank's experience, dozens of similar reports have emerged from Bold Street, all describing the same oppressive silence and temporal displacement. The Vanishing Hotel in France. In October 1979, 2 British couples, the Simpsons and the Giuseppe, were driving through France to Spain when they needed accommodation near Montélimar. After being turned away from a full hotel, they found themselves on a narrow cobbled road that felt oddly outdated. They discovered a peculiar 2-story stone building that looked like something from another era. The rooms had no telephone, no elevator, and fixtures that seemed antique, heavy wooden shutters instead of curtains. At breakfast, they saw 2 policemen in uniforms that predated 1905. The bill was absurdly cheap, less than a tenth of what they expected. 2 weeks later, returning the same route, they searched for hours to find the hotel again. It had completely disappeared. The road itself seemed different. No one in the area had heard of such an establishment. Maps showed nothing matching their description. The couples had receipts, photographs, and detailed memories. Yet the building they'd stayed in it appeared to exist only in the past. 4 people experienced the same temporal anomaly, and their story featured on the British television series Strange But True, with no satisfactory explanation ever found. The Photographer from 1958. In April 2006, a man dressed in vintage clothing was spotted wandering the streets of Kyiv, Ukraine, appearing completely disoriented and shocked. Police officers approached him after he nearly caused several traffic accidents. He carried an old-fashioned camera, wore clothes from the 1950s, and possessed Soviet-era currency that hadn't been in circulation for decades. His identification documents listed him as Sergei Ponomarenko, but the dates indicated they were issued in 1958. Authorities were skeptical until they developed the film in his camera. The photographs showed Kiev as it appeared in the 1950s, with buildings and streetscapes that had long since been demolished or renovated. One image showed a strange bell-shaped object in the sky. According to reports featured on Ukrainian television, Sergei claimed he'd been taking photographs in 1958 when he encountered the unusual aerial object. The next thing he knew, he was in 2006. Before investigators could study his case further or verify his identity claims, Sergei disappeared from the hotel room where authorities had placed him. Guards outside swore no one entered or left. His camera, documents, and the mysterious photographs vanished with him. While this case has debated authenticity, it captured international attention and remains one of the most intriguing modern time traveler claims. The Internet's first time traveler. In November 2000, a user identifying himself as John Titor appeared on internet forums claiming to be a soldier from the year 2036. Unlike typical hoaxers, Titor provided technical diagrams of his time machine, explaining it used rotating singularities and referenced real physics concepts. He described a future following a devastating American Civil War beginning in 2004, with cities destroyed and society fragmented. His mission, he claimed, was retrieving an IBM 5100 computer from 1975 for its unique debugging capabilities. Titor made specific predictions: mad cow disease spreading in America, the 2004 Olympics being canceled, China landing people on the moon. He discussed politics, technology, and worldviews with surprising consistency across hundreds of posts spanning 4 months. Then, in March 2001, he vanished. Years later, investigators discovered that IBM engineers had confirmed the 5100 did have hidden functions that Titor accurately described, features not publicly documented until after his posts. While his major predictions didn't materialize, suggesting either a hoax or an alternate timeline, the technical accuracy and coherent world-building make Titor's case fascinating. Someone invested enormous effort creating either an elaborate fiction or genuine warnings from a branching future. Best 7. The Workman Who Lost 5 Hours. In 1973, 21-year-old Paul was driving home through the English Midlands village of Little Houghton after a dance. He'd drunk very little and felt alert. Around 2 a.m., shortly after passing the church clock, he experienced a complete time lapse. He regained awareness on foot at Bromham, many miles away, soaking wet though it wasn't raining. It was now 7 a.m. 5 hours had vanished. His car was gone. A friend helped him search and found the vehicle in a muddy field near Turvey, about 15 minutes' drive from Little Houghton. The field gate was locked. No tire tracks marked the mud. If Paul had simply blacked out or experienced a fugue state, how did his car get into a locked field without leaving any traces? How did he end up miles away, drenched, with no memory of the journey? Researcher Jenny Randles documented this case in her book, Time Storms, noting the physical impossibility of the car's location. Paul had no history of mental illness, wasn't on medication, and showed no signs of intoxication. Whatever happened during those missing hours defied conventional explanation, leaving only the unsettling possibility that Paul slipped through a gap in time itself. 8. The Soldier Who. Aged 5 days and 15 minutes. April 25, 1977, Pampa Luscuma, Chile. Corporal Armando Valdez led a small military unit on a training exercise at 12,000 feet elevation. Just before 4 a.m., Private Rosales spotted 2 violet lights descending the mountain toward their camp. The ground beneath glowed strangely. Valdez woke the unit and at 4:15 a.m. went to investigate a large violet glow several hundred yards away. His soldiers watched him walk toward the light. Then he vanished. The glow disappeared simultaneously. For 15 minutes, the soldiers waited in terrified silence. At 4:30 a.m., Valdez reappeared, but not from the direction he'd gone. He materialized behind his men. Something was catastrophically wrong. Valdez couldn't speak coherently or coordinate his movements. His watch had stopped at 4:30 a.m., and its date function read April 30th, 5 days ahead. Most disturbing, Valdez had shaved the previous night. Now he sported several days' growth of beard. The soldiers, interviewed separately by Chilean and CIA investigators, all confirmed the timeline and physical changes. Valdez suffered severe memory loss and poor motor control for days afterward. His experience matched other documented cases where individuals returned from temporal displacement unable to perform basic tasks like opening doors. CIA agents found Valdez credible and consistent, noting no evidence of deception or mental illness. The vanishing airfield worker. During World War II, multiple witnesses at various RAF airfields reported seeing ground crew and aircraft that shouldn't exist. In one documented incident, a maintenance worker named Gerald was performing routine checks on a Lancaster bomber when fog rolled across the airfield. Within the mist, he saw an aircraft he didn't recognize, more advanced than anything operational in 1944. Mechanics worked on it wearing unfamiliar uniforms. He approached to investigate. One mechanic looked directly at him, nodded, then returned to work. When Gerald emerged from the fog minutes later, the advanced aircraft had vanished. His colleagues confirmed the fog bank, but they'd seen nothing unusual. Gerald's description of the aircraft matched post-war jet designs that wouldn't exist for years. Similar reports from other airfields during wartime suggested temporal overlaps, perhaps created by the massive electromagnetic activity from radar installations. These incidents were classified and only emerged decades later through Freedom of Information requests. The military never provided explanations, merely noting atmospheric phenomena in official reports. Gerald's experience suggested that, under certain conditions, perhaps related to electromagnetic fields and weather patterns, different time periods might briefly overlap. 10. The department store that shouldn't exist. In 1996, a woman shopping in Liverpool reported entering what she thought was a new department store on Bold Street. The interior looked remarkably old-fashioned, with wooden counters and goods she didn't recognize. The handful of shoppers inside wore vintage clothing. She felt increasingly uncomfortable, as if she didn't belong. When she turned to leave, the store vanished behind her. She found herself standing on the modern street, the building now completely different. Security footage from adjacent businesses showed her entering a doorway, pausing for less than a minute, then rapidly backing out with a shocked expression. The cameras captured nothing unusual about the building itself, but analysts noted a brief visual distortion, almost like heat shimmer, surrounding the woman during those 60 seconds. She wasn't the only one. Multiple shoppers reported similar experiences in Liverpool's city center during the 1990s, all describing entering shops that existed decades earlier. Researchers theorized that Liverpool's underground railway system, which creates electromagnetic fields in circular patterns beneath the city center, might interact with other environmental factors to create temporary portals through time. The concentration of reports around Bold Street suggested something about that specific location made it uniquely vulnerable to these temporal rifts. 11. The Charlie Chaplin Time Traveler. In 2010, filmmaker George Clark discovered something extraordinary while examining bonus footage from the 1928 premiere of Charlie Chaplin's film, The Circus. The footage, shot at Grauman's Chinese Theater in Los Angeles, shows a woman walking past the camera while holding what appears to be a mobile device to her ear, seemingly engaged in conversation. The film quality is clear enough to see her hand gesture and apparent speech. This footage predates even the earliest car phones by decades. Cell phones wouldn't exist for another 60 years. Skeptics suggest she was holding a hearing aid, as portable hearing devices had just begun development in the 1920s. However, hearing aids of that era were large, cumbersome devices, nothing like what she appears to hold. More puzzling is her apparent conversation. Who was she talking to? Others have analyzed her clothing, gait, and demeanor, noting subtle anachronisms beyond just the device. Her shoes seem wrong for 1928 fashion. Her hairstyle doesn't match period trends. Frame-by-frame analysis reveals she appears unconcerned by the crowd and cameras, as if she doesn't quite realize she's in 1928. The footage has been examined by film experts who confirm it's authentic period film with no evidence of manipulation. Whatever that woman held, and whoever she was talking to, remains unexplained. Time traveler or technological anomaly, she represents a genuine mystery captured on film. 12. The South Fork Bridge Hipster. A photograph taken in 1941 during the reopening of the South Fork Bridge in British Columbia, Canada, has puzzled researchers for decades. Among the crowd of people dressed in typical 1940s attire, one man stands out dramatically. He wears sunglasses with a modern design, what appears to be a printed t-shirt under a zip-up sweater, and his hair is styled in a distinctly contemporary fashion. His entire appearance screams 21st century, not 1940s. The photograph is authentic, verified by multiple archival sources and historical societies. It's not a fake. So, who was this man? Skeptics have worked hard to debunk the mystery, noting that sunglasses similar to his design existed in the 1920s, though they were rare. Some have identified sweaters and t-shirts from the 1940s that could match his clothing. His camera might be a folding Kodak, available at the time. Yet, when all these elements combine, his overall appearance still seems impossibly modern. Even if every individual item existed in 1941, the probability of one person wearing this exact combination, while everyone else around him dresses conventionally, seems astronomically low. He looks exactly like someone from the 2000s who accidentally stepped into 1941. The photograph has been examined by experts who find no evidence of manipulation or forgery. Whatever the explanation, the time-traveling hipster remains one of the most visually striking pieces of potential temporal anomaly evidence ever captured. 13. The Phantom Battle of Edge Hill. On October 23, 1642, Royalist and parliamentary forces clashed at Edge Hill in England's first major battle of the Civil War. Thousands died in brutal combat. 2 months later, on Christmas Eve, local shepherds reported seeing and hearing the entire battle replay itself in the sky above the field. The sounds of cannon fire, screaming men, and clash of steel echoed across the hills. Ghostly armies fought with terrifying clarity. The witnesses included clergymen, magistrates, and other respectable citizens whose testimony was documented in contemporaneous accounts. King Charles I, intrigued by these reports, sent officers to investigate. These military men witnessed the spectral battle themselves and recognized fallen comrades among the phantom combatants. Their official report confirmed the phenomenon. The phantom battle appeared multiple times over subsequent months, always on weekend nights, visible to multiple witnesses simultaneously. Unlike typical ghost stories, this wasn't a brief apparition, but a full recreation lasting hours, complete with accurate historical details verified by survivors. Modern researchers have struggled to explain Edge Hill. Mass hallucination seems unlikely given the number and credibility of witnesses across multiple events. Some theorize extreme violence creates temporal echoes, residual energy that plays back under certain conditions. Others suggest the witnesses experienced time slips, briefly perceiving past events as if present. Edge Hill remains one of the earliest well-documented cases suggesting time isn't strictly linear, but can loop back on itself under mysterious circumstances. 14. The disappearing Spanish village. In 1980, a group of travelers in Spain stopped at a small village for lunch. The village seemed oddly quiet and old-fashioned. The restaurant they entered had no electricity, using candles for light. The menu offered items they didn't recognize, and prices were absurdly low. The waitress wore vintage clothing and seemed confused by their questions about phone service. After eating, they paid in modern currency, which the waitress accepted with visible puzzlement. They took photographs of the village's unusual architecture. When they tried to return weeks later, they couldn't find the village. The road they'd taken seemed different. Local authorities had no record of any village matching their description in that area. When they developed their film, the photographs showed the village clearly, but something was off. The image quality seemed degraded, as if photographing something not quite solid. Vegetation in the images looked slightly wrong, as if from a different season, or even different plants than grew in modern Spain. The travelers maintained detailed diaries and had receipts from the restaurant, stamped with a date matching their trip. But the stamp used a calendar format that hadn't been standard in Spain for decades. The case was investigated by researchers who found the group credible, with no apparent motive for fabrication. They concluded the travelers had somehow entered a pocket of the past, a village existing simultaneously in multiple time periods, with occasional visitors from the present able to briefly access it under unknown conditions. 15. The Nuki Beach Anomaly. In 1943, during World War II, an authentic photograph was taken of holidaymakers on Towan Beach in Nuki, Cornwall. In 2018, when multimedia artist Stuart Humphreys uploaded this archival photo to Twitter, viewers noticed something extraordinary. Among the beachgoers in 1940s bathing attire, one man appears to be holding and operating what looks remarkably like a modern mobile device. His posture, the way he's looking down at his hands, and the rectangular object he's holding all suggest contemporary smartphone use. The photograph is genuine, verified by archival experts. It's not manipulated or faked. Humphreys himself dismissed the time travel theories, suggesting the man was rolling a cigarette. But analysis of his hand position and the object's apparent size and shape don't quite match cigarette rolling. Others have suggested a notebook or small book, yet the man's specific posture, leaning slightly forward with both hands engaged, mirrors exactly how people hold smartphones. The beach scene was photographed during wartime Britain, a period of strict rationing and hardship. Yet this man seems anachronistic not just in what he's holding, but in his entire demeanor, relaxed and absorbed in a way that suggests modern distracted smartphone use rather than wartime consciousness. The photograph went viral globally, picked up by news outlets in dozens of countries. Whether time traveler, remarkable coincidence, or misidentified object, the image represents another instance where photographic evidence suggests temporal displacement. 16. The missing hiker who returned decades later. In 1976, a hiker named Danny disappeared in the Yorkshire Dales, England. Search parties found no trace of him. The case went cold. In 2001, 25 years later, a hiker emerged from the Dales claiming to be Danny. He looked appropriate for someone in their 20s, not someone who should be approaching 50. He carried 1970s gear, wore vintage clothing, and seemed utterly confused by modern technology. He insisted only a few hours had passed since he'd entered the hills. Medical examination revealed he was indeed the age he appeared, not his chronological age. His fingerprints matched records from 1976, but biologically, he'd aged perhaps a few hours, not 25 years. Danny remembered entering a strange fog bank in the hills, experiencing severe disorientation, then emerging into what he thought was the same afternoon. He couldn't explain or accept that decades had passed. Psychological evaluation found him sane, but deeply traumatized by his situation. His family confirmed his identity through DNA testing. He knew nothing of world events after 1976. No explanation was ever found for how he'd spent 25 years aging only hours. He struggled to adapt to modern life, and eventually moved to a remote area, trying to live as he remembered. The case was documented by researchers Jenny Randles and documented in regional newspapers, though national coverage was limited. Danny represents the terrifying possibility that some who disappear don't simply die, but slip through time, emerging decades later, having experienced only moments. The Gettysburg Ghost Soldiers. July 1863 saw one of the American Civil War's bloodiest battles at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. For days afterward, residents reported seeing ghost soldiers, but these weren't typical apparitions. Multiple witnesses described encountering Confederate and Union soldiers who appeared solid, real, and confused. They asked for water, directions, or news of the battle. They seemed unaware they were casualties or that the battle had ended. Some witnesses tried to help these soldiers, offering assistance only to have them vanish suddenly. The encounters continued sporadically for months after the battle. What makes these reports compelling is their consistency across multiple unconnected witnesses. The soldiers described specific regiments, officers, and details that witnesses later confirmed through military records. They couldn't have known this information without direct battle participation. Unlike standard hauntings where ghosts typically ignore the living, these soldiers interacted, conversed, and showed awareness of their surroundings. Some researchers theorize that the extreme trauma and electromagnetic chaos of the massive battle created temporal instabilities. The soldiers might not have been ghosts at all, but individuals briefly displaced in time, appearing days or weeks after their actual deaths, but unaware time had passed. Gettysburg remains one of the most haunted locations in America, but perhaps some of its hauntings are actually time slips, brief windows into July 1863 that occasionally open, allowing the past to bleed into the present. 18. The London Underground Time Displacement. In 1988, a woman named Helen was riding the London Underground's Northern Line late at night. Between stations, the train entered a tunnel section and seemed to slow unnaturally. The lights flickered. Helen felt intense disorientation. When the train emerged into the next station, everything looked wrong. The platform design, the advertisements, even the people's clothing seemed decades out of date. She exited the train, thinking she'd somehow gotten on the wrong line. The station sign confirmed she was in the right place, but it looked different, older, as if from the 1950s. She approached a station attendant, but he ignored her completely, as if she weren't there. She tried to speak to other passengers, but they seemed not to hear her. Panicked, she ran back to the platform. A train arrived, modern and normal. She boarded. By the next station, everything had returned to 1988. The entire incident lasted perhaps 15 minutes. Helen reported it to London Underground authorities, who politely dismissed her experience as stress or illness. But she wasn't the only one. The Underground has accumulated reports of similar temporal anomalies for decades, particularly on the Northern Line. Some researchers speculate the deep tunnels, electromagnetic fields from the trains, and geological factors might create zones where time becomes unstable. The Underground represents a massive intervention in London's ancient geology. Perhaps drilling through those layers exposed something that occasionally allows slippage between different time periods, creating brief pockets where past and present overlap. 19. The antique shop that never was. In 1993, an antique collector named Martin was driving through rural Connecticut when he spotted a shop he'd never noticed before, despite traveling that route regularly. The building looked Victorian, beautifully maintained with genuine period details. Inside, he found incredible treasures, 18th and 19th century items in pristine condition. The prices were absurdly low. The proprietor, an elderly gentleman in old-fashioned clothing, seemed oddly formal in his speech. Martin purchased several valuable pieces, paid cash, and received a handwritten receipt. He planned to return soon for more. When he tried to find the shop again, it had vanished. The building itself was gone. The property where it stood was vacant land overgrown with vegetation that looked undisturbed for years. Local residents insisted no antique shop had existed there in living memory. Martin had his purchases, beautiful authenticated period pieces. His receipt showed a date matching his visit, but the paper itself was old, the ink faded as if decades old despite being written days earlier. Historical research revealed an antique shop had operated near that location in the 1920s, run by a man matching the proprietor's description. It had burned down in 1927. Martin theorized he'd somehow accessed the shop, as it existed nearly 70 years earlier. He never tried to return, frightened by the implications. His story was documented by paranormal researchers, and the items he purchased were examined by experts who confirmed they were genuine period pieces in impossibly good condition for their age. 20. The radio signal from the past. In 1982, amateur radio enthusiast Mike in California received a distress call on a rarely used maritime frequency. The voice used outdated radio protocols and terminology. The caller identified himself as crew from the steamship Waratah, requesting assistance due to engine failure off the South African coast. Mike tried to respond, but the signal was too weak. He contacted the Coast Guard. Research revealed the Waratah vanished in July 1909 with 211 passengers and crew, disappearing without trace off South Africa. No wreckage was ever found. The case became one of maritime history's greatest mysteries. Mike's recording of the distress call was analyzed by experts. The voice used naval terms and accents appropriate to 1909. The radio technology itself puzzled analysts. The signal showed characteristics of spark gap transmitters, obsolete technology from the early 20th century, but spark gap transmitters couldn't reach across oceans, especially not to California 73 years later. Yet Mike's equipment definitely received something. Multiple witnesses at his radio club heard the transmission. The recording exists. Some theorize that under specific atmospheric conditions, radio signals can become trapped, bouncing through the ionosphere for decades before being received. Others suggest Mike briefly connected with a temporal echo, receiving a distress call not from 1982, but actually from 1909, transmitted across time rather than just distance. The Waratah incident remains unsolved. If Mike's transmission was genuine, 211 souls called desperately for help as they went down. But their signal traveled through time, arriving decades too late in a world that had forgotten them. 21. The battlefield time slip at Dieppe. In 1951, two English tourists visiting Dieppe, France, were awakened at 4 a.m. by the sound of battle. Machine gun fire, explosions, and the sounds of men dying filled the air. The noise was deafening, seemingly right outside their hotel window. They looked out but saw nothing, just the peaceful early morning town. Yet the sounds continued for hours, matching exactly what they had later learned was the timeline of the disastrous 1942 Dieppe raid, when Allied forces suffered catastrophic casualties in a failed amphibious assault. The sounds they heard matched recorded accounts from survivors of where fighting occurred. They couldn't have known this beforehand, as they were unfamiliar with Dieppe's wartime history. The experience so disturbed them, they checked out immediately. Years later, they discovered other visitors to Dieppe had reported identical experiences on the anniversary of the raid. The phenomena repeated specifically on August 19th, the date of the battle. Researchers documented multiple independent witnesses hearing these phantom battle sounds over several decades. Unlike Edgehill, where visual apparitions appeared, Dieppe presented purely auditory phenomena. Some theorize that extreme violence imprints on locations, creating permanent recordings in the environment that replay under certain conditions. Others suggest witnesses experienced genuine time slips, briefly accessing the actual sounds from 1942. The consistency of reports across unconnected witnesses makes mass hallucination unlikely. Something about Dieppe, about that specific date and the trauma of that battle, allows the past to echo forward into the present. 22. The shopping mall from another timeline. In 2008, a teenager named Sarah was shopping at a mall in suburban America when she felt suddenly disoriented. The shops around her looked slightly different. The clothing in store windows seemed outdated. The people walking past wore styles she didn't recognize. Not quite modern, but not clearly from any specific past decade. Everything felt slightly off, as if reality had shifted left by a few degrees. She sat down, thinking she was ill. After perhaps 10 minutes, everything snapped back to normal. The stores displayed current merchandise. People dressed in contemporary fashion. She found her friends where she'd left them. They insisted she'd been gone only a minute, yet her phone showed 10 minutes had elapsed. Sarah experienced no memory of those missing minutes beyond the strange sensory displacement. Similar reports have emerged from shopping malls worldwide. These vast commercial spaces built on previously empty land. Some researchers theorize that malls, with their artificial environments isolated from natural surroundings, might create zones vulnerable to temporal instability. The electromagnetic fields from countless electronic devices, the geometric layouts designed for maximum shopping efficiency, and the disconnection from natural time markers like sunlight might combine to create spatial temporal anomalies. Sarah's experience matched dozens of other reports from malls, all describing the same, slightly off quality, as if briefly accessing an alternate timeline where small details differ. The phenomena suggests time might not be singular, but branched, with occasional accidental crossings between parallel present moments. 23. The Vanishing Hitchhiker Across Decades. The Vanishing Hitchhiker is a classic ghost story, but some cases suggest something stranger than spirits. In 1975, a driver in England picked up a young woman hitchhiking on a country road. She gave specific directions to an address in a nearby town, spoke normally during the drive, and seemed entirely solid and real. When they reached the address, she asked him to wait while she got money to pay for the ride. She entered the house. He waited and waited. Eventually, he knocked on the door. An elderly woman answered. When he explained about the hitchhiker, the woman went pale. She showed him a photograph of a young woman who looked exactly like his passenger, her daughter, who had died in a car accident on that same road in 1965. Multiple drivers reported picking up this same hitchhiker over 3 decades, all giving identical descriptions and experiencing the same vanishing. But this wasn't a typical ghost. The hitchhiker seemed unaware she was dead, gave coherent directions, engaged in normal conversation. She might not have been a ghost at all, but someone caught in a time loop, repeating the same journey night after night, unaware that decades were passing outside her bubble of frozen time. The case was extensively documented with multiple independent witnesses, police reports, and the mother who confirmed each detail. The hitchhiker represents the possibility that some individuals become trapped in temporal loops, repeating specific moments eternally while the world moves forward around them. 24. The Classroom That Visited 1950. In 2003, an entire school classroom in Australia experienced a collective time slip. During a history lesson about the 1950s, students and their teacher simultaneously felt the room change. The fluorescent lights seemed to flicker and dim, replaced by warmer, older lighting. The modern classroom equipment disappeared, replaced by vintage school desks and materials. They could see through the windows, but the view outside showed buildings that no longer existed. Cars from the 1950s, and people in period clothing. The entire class experienced this together for approximately 3 minutes. Then it snapped back to normal. All students independently drew pictures of what they'd seen, and the details matched remarkably. They described specific buildings that the teacher confirmed had stood there in the 1950s, but were demolished before any of the students were born. This wasn't information they could have known. The school investigated thoroughly, considering carbon monoxide, psychological factors, or other conventional explanations. None fit. 14 people simultaneously experienced the same vivid perception of a different time period, The incident was documented by local authorities and education officials. The entire class visiting the past together suggests temporal displacement might not always be individual, but can occasionally affect multiple people simultaneously. Whatever allowed that classroom to briefly access 1950 affected everyone in the room equally, creating a shared experience that remains unexplained. 25. The future nobody expected. In 1990, a man named Thomas was driving through rural Wales when his car died on a deserted road. No mechanical problem was apparent. The engine simply stopped. He tried his mobile phone, but it wouldn't work, though he had full battery and signal. He felt intensely uncomfortable, as if he didn't belong there. Then he saw it, in the distance, a massive structure that shouldn't exist. It looked like a huge futuristic building or facility, gleaming metallic in the moonlight, with architecture unlike anything he'd seen. He watched it for perhaps 5 minutes, trying to understand what he was seeing. Then his car started spontaneously, and the structure vanished. Years later, Thomas learned that plans existed for a military facility near that location, but it was never built, canceled in the 1970s. However, concept drawings of the proposed facility matched his description perfectly. Researchers theorized Thomas might have experienced a forward time slip, briefly perceiving a future that never manifested because the project was abandoned. This suggests time might not be singular, but contain multiple potential futures existing simultaneously. Under certain conditions, perhaps linked to electromagnetic anomalies, people might briefly access these alternate timelines, seeing futures that could have been or still might be. Thomas's experience was documented by temporal phenomena researchers who found him credible and consistent. His case suggests that time travel might not always be about visiting the past, but occasionally glimpsing futures that exist in quantum probability.